Okay, so what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is give you a quick overview of the Synergy DE, xfServerPlus and xfNetlink.net products and show you how they can be used to integrate .NET client applications with Synergy server applications. Right now we're in the Synergy Professional Series Workbench, which is the IDE, the Integrated Development Environment for Synergy development on the Windows platform. What I'm going to do is open up a project that I already have existing. It's just a standard demo project that I use to show xfServerPlus in use. And in this project you'll see we've got several sub-projects. One of them is called Server. And if we look in there, what you'll find is we've got lots of Synergy source files. These are the routines essentially that we're going to expose to the .NET client via the xfServerPlus and xfNetlink products. And if we look through some of those routines, what you'll find is that they're nothing particularly strange. They're just regular Synergy routines on the whole. There are several of them. For example, in this particular application environment, the first method that gets called, method is the name we tend to give to the routines when they're used in this environment. So the first method that's called is a Synergy function called initialize, and this function is responsible for primarily opening up data files and setting up an environment once we get a connection. So it's similar to setting up an environment when a user logs in, essentially. And as you can see, it's just using an open statement to open several ISAM files, and the channel numbers in this case are being stored in a global data section that's included in this include file remote .def. In fact, we can see that include file down here. Just regular Synergy stuff. We've got a global data section with a shared record with various channel numbers and various other pieces of data that we can use in this and other methods. So there's an example of a very simple Synergy routine. You call initialize, it's a hatval function, so it returns an int true-false value. It's called, it does its job. If it gets a problem, it returns an error status. The next routine used by the application is the login routine, and again this is just a Synergy function, so it returns in this case most of these routines have been set up to return 0 for zero for success, and any other number is representing an error number. So again, this is just a regular Synergy routine that accepts a username and a password. It returns a status through the function return status. Potentially it can return an error message, and on successful login it returns the user record as well to the client application. And if we look briefly at the code, you'll see all it's doing is saying make sure we've got a username and password, otherwise report an error. Then go off and validate the passwords, we uppercase it, we read the user record. %io is just a Synergy file IO function, so it reads the record from the user file, returns an error no such user, compares the password, potentially returns an error invalid password, and then returns the success status of the routine. Just regular Synergy code. And all of these routines are pretty similar. They just do certain functions. For example, if we the sample application has product groups with products, customers with orders, orders have line items. So for example, if we look at let's have a look at get product groups. The get product groups routine basically simply returns, we're using dynamic memory in Synergy DE, so this is a memory handle. It returns a collection of any number of product group records, and again you'll see that we're just doing a move first in the product group file, and then we're in a loop essentially doing a read-s and adding the results to the dynamically sized memory, which is basically allocated and resized if necessary, and then resized to the correct size before returning. So that's a way of putting any number of records into a piece of memory that gets returned to the client. In version 9 of Synergy, we have some alternate ways of doing things. We have OO support in Synergy. So now we're using an ArrayList class, and this is the version 9 version of the routine. And you can see it's quite a bit simpler. We simply do a read first, we have a loop that's doing a read next, and every time a product group record is found, we simply do a product groups dot add and add the record to the collection that then gets returned to the client. So both examples in here of using some of the older syntax with dynamic memory and the newer syntax with Synergy objects and array lists. All of these routines are just fairly simple Synergy routines. So for example, get orders takes a customer code and returns a memory handler collection of order header records for a customer. Get order items takes in an order number and returns a collection of order item records for the customer. Get all products simply returns a collection of all the products in the product file, for example. Versus the get products routines that say give me a product group and I'll return all the products for that product group. And various other things. We've also got methods in here that allow us to say, where is it, for example, we can update a product, so we can pass in a new product record and have it updated in the file. We can delete a product. We can create a new order. So this routine takes an order header record and takes an array of order item records and simply validates the data and stores the data into the ISAM files. So we expose the functionality of the application through writing Synergy subroutines and functions. Those routines all get compiled in the normal way and built into an executable library. In fact, in Workbench I can show you that happening. I've got my project set up so that when I do a build, you can see those routines simply being compiled, put into an object library and linked into an ELB. So we now have an ELB, an executable library called server.elb that contains all of those routines that we can expose to the .NET client. Once we're done with that, there's one additional step that we wouldn't have to do if we were doing just regular Synergy development. We use something called the method definition utility. And the MDU is simply a simple Synergy toolkit program that allows us to define the methods that we're going to expose to the remote client through xfnetlink.net. So you'll see we've got all of those methods defined in here. So we simply come into here and we define, let's look at the login routine, for example. What we're saying here is we're saying there is going to be a routine exposed to the remote client. It's going to be part of the interface called utils. When we expose information to .NET, .NET is an OO environment. So what we're going to do here is our tools will create a class called utils, and login will be a method within that class. This is the name of the Synergy routine on the server. This is the name of the ELB that contains that routine. We define the return type, whether it's a subroutine or a function, for example. We can put descriptive information in here too if we wish. And then we define the parameters that that routine has. So here we can see we've got a parameter called username, which is an A40. It's a required parameter and it's passed in from the client. Password is also passed in. Error message is passed out, and user record is passed out. And behind each of these there's a little form that allows us to define the parameter, its data type, its size, whether it's passed in, out, whether it's one of them or a collection of them or an array of them, and so on. So we just define all the parameters. We do that for each of the methods that we expose to the client. So you'll see all of those same methods. Here we have create order. We look at its parameters. We have an order header record. It's a structure. So it's a record. It's an order header record. It's passed in from the client. The second parameter here is, again, structure, so record order line, but this time it's an array of those that's been passed in from the client. If we look at one other example, let's look at the get products. So get products, if we look at its parameters, you'll see we have a product group, which is an A10 required passed in, and then we have products, which is again a record called product, and it's returned to the client as an array list, and in .NET turned into a data table, and it's passed out to the client. So again, we're just defining the parameters to the routines that we're exposing. Okay, so we have the method definition utility. The next step in this puzzle is to use a couple of tools that turn the information that we've defined into Synergy into something we can use in .NET. So what we then do is we can use a couple of command line tools. There's one tool called genxml, which reads all of that information about the data and what you've defined in the catalog and creates an XML file. The reason we use an XML file is that's a platform independent way of moving information around. Remember, this development environment might be a Unix system or a VMS system, and we want to create a .NET component. So we use XML as a mechanism for communicating information about our methods and our data structures in a form that we can take from Unix or VMS or Windows to a Windows.NET development environment and do something with. Then we use a tool called genCS, and what genCS does is it reads the information in that XML file, the information that came from the catalog that you've just defined, and also comes from the repository that defines the data structures, and it creates native .NET code. We actually generate using C# as a language, and we create a batch file that builds that C# code into something called an assembly, a DLL, and that can be something that's usable directly in a .NET development project, and you'll see that happening in a little while. So we can do it at the command line. We can also do it in Workbench. We have a project template that allows us to automate those steps. So if we go into here and look at this component information, what you'll see is we're asking this project to create a .NET assembly called xfPL demo. We're telling it where we want to create the assembly. We're giving it a namespace. In .NET, classes are all part of something called a namespace. We tell the tool where our repository is. That tells it how to get to our data definitions. And we tell it where our method catalog is and which classes or interfaces from that method catalog we want to expose through this particular assembly. So we just give it that information. When we're done, we can ask it to go off and generate the C# code that represents the Synergy methods that we've created. And you can see it's going ahead and doing that. Here's all the C# code that got generated. What we have is one class that has versions of all our methods in there. So here's a C# method called createOrder. Here's one called createProductGroup, and the parameters match what we defined in the catalog. So these routines we can call, these get built into a native .NET assembly, and we can call these from any .NET language. We also have data classes that represent our data structures. So here we have a class called product, and you can see that it has properties in there for the SKU, the product group, the description, the price group, the selling price. Each of these, essentially this class represents a Synergy product record, and each field in the record is represented by a property in the .NET class, so that the developers in Visual Studio developing the client application can simply work with objects and properties and not have to worry about Synergy data types and Synergy storage at all. It's completely native. They don't need to know anything about Synergy, in fact. All of that gets built automatically. When you generate the code, we also generate a batch file that builds it in the Workbench project. You can also build it yourself. So I can go here and say build assembly, and that will actually create the assembly for me. So now I actually have a .NET assembly sitting on my disk. That's a file with a DLL extension. If I go out and browse around, I should be able to show you that. If I go into Files, Demo, xfServerPlus, Component for .NET, what you'll find is this is the source code that we just generated, and you'll find that we have xfPLDemo.dll. This is a native .NET assembly that allows me to access all of those Synergy routines from the .NET client. Of course, before we can do that, we have to set up xfServerPlus, and on a Windows system, that's done using a utility, which is called the Synergy Configuration Program. And all we have to do is xfServerPlus runs as a Windows service on the machine, so it's like a detached process. It's sat there running all the time. And here we can manage those services. I've already created one called xfPLDemo. And it has a certain TCP/IP port number that it's listening on. It knows how to do a login to this particular server machine, and it has some definitions of environment settings. So it has an initialization file location specified, and that initialization file has things in there. In fact, let me show you it right now. If we go to server, I can show you that INI file. Here it is, and it tells the server where its log file should be. It sets any logical names that are required by the Synergy code, exe to let me define the location of the ELB, dat is used in code to say open a file, and various other things, the location of the method catalog and so on. So this file configures the xfServerPlus environment. So we use the Synergy configuration program to create an xfServerPlus service. I've actually got 4 of them running on different ports for different applications, and that we now have the ability to connect to that environment from the XF Netlink client. Let me quickly show you an example of an XF Netlink client if we run up Visual Studio. First of all, I'll show you an example of an existing client application that I already have in existence that's talking to that environment that we've just seen, and then I'll show you a little bit about how we go about actually coding in this environment, in the client environment. So if I go and open up a project, this particular project is a Windows Forms project. It's using Visual Basic as a language, but that's irrelevant. You can use any .NET language, and it's made up of a couple of forms. You'll see we have a form called Form Main, and in here we've got various tabs, so we can browse product information, we can browse orders for the user that's logged in, and we can go ahead and create new orders. When we run this application, but let me show you one other thing. I have an application configuration file here, and in there, part of the information I've got is this xfnl.net section. This is identifying host and port. So this is basically saying my xfServerPlus machine is, in this case it's the same system, and this is the port number that xfServerPlus is listening on. So I've got information in my application that tells it where my server is and what port is required to connect to that server. Let me just run the application and show you what it does first of all, and then we'll show you a little bit of code. So we run the application. It's going to prompt me for a login. I've hard-coded my username and password in there. It's just a little demo environment. So as soon as I hit this button, in fact, I believe it's already made a connection to the server at this point and called the initialize method. And when I press this button, it's going to go ahead and call the login method and then start doing some other things. So we do that, we go ahead. We've called several methods at this point. We've called the go get me the product groups, and we've bound those to this little list box down the side. We've called go get the products for a product group, and that's bound to this list of products down here. And as you can see, every time we pick a new product group, we're making a method call to Synergy to say give me the products for that product group, and binding the results to the grid in this case. We can also go to browse orders. When I do this, it's going to call the get me all the orders method for my logged in user, and it's giving me a list of all the orders that that particular user account has. And again, every time I click on an order, it's going and getting the order details. It's doing a get order, so it's getting the order header information, which is up here, and the order items, which are down here. The final thing we can do in this little very simple demo application is we can go ahead and create a new order. Now it's just another way of browsing product groups, so I can pick a product group, I can see the products in that product group, I can set a quantity, and I can add that item to my order, to my cart essentially. So I can build up my order, shopping basket if you like. When I'm done, I can say go ahead and place the order, which calls that create order method on the server, passes the information, saves it in the ISAM files, and returns the order number to me that I'm just displaying in this little pop-up box. In fact, if we go back to the browse orders, it hasn't refreshed. It doesn't refresh. I was going to look at order number 71, but this particular application doesn't refresh its list of orders once it's got them. So if we were to log out and log back in again, let's do that. So we'll close it down, we'll run it again, we'll do our login, go to our orders, and there's order number 71 that we just placed. So that's a very quick example of the xfServerPlus and XF Netlink products in use from a Visual Basic Windows Forms application in this case. Let's show you a little bit of the code. If we look at the code behind in Visual Basic, what you'll see is that when the main form loads, this is the code that executes, and here we've got code that connects to xfServerPlus. So utils, if you remember, was the class that we defined in our method catalog in Synergy. xfPL demo up here was the namespace that we used when we created the .NET assembly. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new instance of that class that has all my Synergy methods in, and I'm calling it Synergy. Okay, then I'm saying synergy.connect. So this is basically saying go connect to xfServerPlus. At that point, it's looking at the information in the app config file and finding out which host and port we have to connect to. You'll notice this is all in a try-catch block, so if anything goes wrong, then we'll get some error messages popping up. So if that is successful, then I call the initialize method, if synergy.initialize. And you can see how native this code looks. In fact, we get all the IntelliSense as well. So, you know, when I say synergy dot, it shows me about, these are all my synergy methods that I have available. Get products v8, get products v9, get products, and so on. And in fact, when we've picked a method, let me go up here. If we say synergy dot get products v9 open paren, we're also going to get the IntelliSense for the method parameters as well. So this one's expecting product group as string, and by ref means it's returning products as a product DT, a data table in this case, and it has a return status of an integer. So it's giving me lots of help about how to use these things. Also, if we define a synergy record, so let's say product, I'm in VB, dim x as new, let's say product. This is our synergy product record. When I say x dot, now I get to see all of the fields within the product record, and you'll see I'm dealing with .NET types. So I'm dealing with strings and ints and booleans and all of those good things. Completely native in this environment. I don't need to know anything about synergy alphas and decimals and all that kind of thing. I'm just dealing with native types and getting all the IntelliSense support that I would expect. Here you can see, so we connect, we call the initialize method, we do error checking, we're looking for fatal errors. Here's where we do our login. If we get past our login form, and you can see it's displaying the login form, and when the login form comes back, it creates a new Synergy user record and then calls the synergy.login routine, passing the username and the password, getting back error text and user. So this is just completely native Visual Basic code in this case, that is interacting with the Synergy routines via xfServerPlus. Here we create a customer record. We set the customer account to the user's customer account number, and we call the get customer record. So we retrieve the customer record for the user that's logged in. Here we create an array list that we're going to use to get our product groups in, and we call the Synergy method get product groups, and we pass the array list to get back that collection of product group records. And so on and so on and so on. Here's an example of the get orders routine. Synergy.get orders, passing customer.account, and getting back orders, which again is in .NET is an array list, a collection of order records, and so on. So it's very, very straightforward to use. It's just Synergy routines on the Synergy side. It's completely native .NET coding on the .NET side in Visual Basic or C# or any other .NET language that you might choose to use. Okay, let's briefly show you a fairly simple example of how easy these technologies are to use. So we're here in Visual Studio. This time I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to choose C# as a language, and I'm going to choose to create a Windows Forms application. In order that we can use the xfNetlink assembly and xfNetlink itself, the one we created earlier, and the assembly that Synergex provide when you install xfNetlink on your machine, I need to add references to those assemblies to my project. And I can either browse for them on disk, or I can use my recent list if I've selected them recently. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick our xfpl demo assembly. There's the one we created earlier. And I'm also going to pick the xfnlnet assembly. So this is the one Synergex provide with the installation. This is the one you built using our tools. So we'll add references to both of those to our project, and that essentially makes everything in those assemblies, all those classes that we've created, representing our Synergy methods that we can call and our data structures, available in this project. Now what I'm going to do is create a simple little UI for this form. Let's set the form's title to Product Browser, and we'll keep it really simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a combo box control to the form, and I'm going to name that combo box, we'll call it combo, and I'm going to add a data grid view, a simple grid control to the form. We'll stretch it out a little bit and we'll name that one grid. Okay, I'm going to do a bit of configuration here. I'm going to tell these two controls what type of data they can expect to receive. So I'm going to pick the combo control and I'm going to go and tell it that its data source is going to be a new data source based on an object that we have in our environment. It's in our xfPL demo assembly. Here's our namespace, and here's all the classes in the namespace. So these are all based on the Synergy data types primarily. And the one I want for this one is product groups. So I'm going to tell it that this is going to be a product group data table. I'm going to call a method that's going to give me a data table full of product groups back from a Synergy method call. So I'm going to associate that data type with that combo box, and further I'm going to tell it that the thing I want to display in the combo box is the description field from the product group, and the value that I want to use is the name of the product group. So we'll see the description, but behind the scenes the selected item will be the name of the product group. I'm going to basically do a similar thing with the grid. So I'm going to tell it that its data source is going to be from a project data source based on an object in our project, in our xfPL demo assembly namespace, and this one is going to be a product data table. And you can see that the grid has automatically looked at that and populated columns that are available in the grid, and we can start customizing those at this point if we wish. If there are certain things we don't want to see, then we can remove those columns, and so on, and we can customize how the grid is displayed. Okay, so we've done our basic configuration of our UI. Let's go into some code. The first thing we need to do is have a mechanism to communicate with the server. That's going to be an instance of our utils class that we defined in our Synergy method catalog. So I'm going to say xfPL demo, which is our namespace, dot utils. This is the class I want to use. In my program, I'm going to call it server. And when the form loads, I want to create an instance of that class. So server equals new xfPLDemo.utils. That gives me an instance of that class, an object that I can now start calling its methods. That server object, this variable here, now is my handle on that object, so I can start calling my Synergy methods through there. If I say server dot, I'll see all of the methods that I have available. And if I pause, you'll see the parameters. The first thing I need to do is ask it to connect to xfServerPlus, and I'm not using the application configuration file that we saw earlier, so I'm going to use an alternate constructor to tell it the IP address, or in this case the name of the host I want to connect to, my system, and the port number that I know xfServerPlus is running on. Again, I should be doing error trapping at this point and checking return statuses and so on, but I'm just going to assume everything's going to work okay. As we saw earlier in our Synergy environment, we also have that initialize method that opens all the files, and we have to call that first. So let's go ahead and call the initialize method. And again, I really should be doing error trapping and checking return statuses, but I'm going to assume it's going to work okay. So when we load this program, we're going to create an instance of our Synergy class, we're going to connect to xfServerPlus, and we're going to call our initialize routine to open all our files on the server. We don't have to do that, that's just the way this environment's been defined for the demo. We also need to do the reverse of this stuff and disconnect when we close the program. So let's go to the form, look at its event handlers, and what I'm going to do is pick the form closing event and put some code in there to disconnect us. So I'm going to call server.disconnect to disconnect from the server from xfServerPlus and destroy the server object. Okay, so as we run the program, we connect and call the initialize method to open the files. As we close the program, we disconnect. Next, what we need to happen is as we get into the program, we want to populate our combo box with all the product groups. So we need to call the Synergy getProductGroups v9 in this case. That's the name of the method that we're going to call. And it returns a product group data table. So I'm going to say xfPL demo.product group data table. That's the data type. I'm going to call it groups. That's the name of my object. And I'm going to go ahead and create one. So I've got an instance of that object. Now I can call my Synergy method and pass that to get the data. So let's say server, that represents our server connection, dot, we're going to call the get product groups v9 method, and it wants a reference to a product groups data table, which we've already got. So reference to groups. That's the variable we just defined. That should get us the list of product groups. The final thing we need to do is bind that data table to our combo box. So combo dot data source equals groups. Okay, now what we should find when we run our program, it should connect, call the initialize method, get the list of product groups and bind them to the combo, and we can see there, we can see the result of that. That combo now has those values bound. We can see the description. When we select one, the value is actually the name of the product group, not the textual description that we're seeing. Okay, so now what we need to do is say, well, when this changes, we need to go get the products for a product group and put them in the grid down here. So that's just a little bit more code. So let's close the program. That will disconnect us from the server because of our form closing code down here. Let's go back to the designer and select the combo box and look at its events. And when the selected index changes, that means a user picked a new item. What we're going to do is load the products for that product group. So the products method is going to return us a product data table. So xfPL demo, that's our namespace, dot product dt, there's our product data table. We declare one, and I'm going to call it products, and go create a new one. So now we have an empty product data table, and we call the Synergy method to populate it. So server.get products v9, and we pass the product group. Well, the product group we want is in the combo box. So that's combo dot selected value, and we want it as a string. So let's call it toString method, and we'll pass our product data table. So that should retrieve the data table. Oops, it needs a reference to the product data table. I apologize. Ref. So this is saying from the combo box, get the selected value and turn it into a string so that we can pass it to our Synergy alpha parameter. That's the product group, and we get back a data table of products. And again, we just need to do the data binding. So grid this time, dot data source equals products. So put the product data table into the grid. And that should be all we have to do so that when we pick a new product group in the combo, we get the product groups, the products in that product group displayed in the grid. Let's go ahead and run it. Slight delay while it starts the program and connects to xfServerPlus and calls the initialize method. And there you go, you can see it's already happened. When the value of this changed because of the data binding on the combo, it went and loaded the products for the product group. If we pick a different one, we should see a different set of products. And you can see the concept here is when we get an event in the UI that needs us to interact with the back-end server, we put some code in there to call the appropriate method and deal with the data that comes back. And that's the basis of building an application with Visual Studio and interacting with Synergy DE through xfNetlink on the client side, talking to xfServerPlus on the server side. Hopefully that was a little introduction for you. If you need more information about this, please feel free to contact your Synergy DE account manager.